Hello again, and thanks for dropping by to watch me create one of my paintings where I transfer ink from magazines onto a layer of beeswax. And we're going to start here with the beeswax on the panel, and what I'm doing is heating the panel, the beeswax, and then taking a tool and scraping off a layer or so just to get to the smooth part, taking those ridges out and trying to get as much of the grooves and the pits out as possible, so that when I put my magazine ink on top of the beeswax, it's a flat surface, as flat as I can get it, so I get a good transfer. I'll do this until it almost looks like glass, even though it still has a lot of imperfections. I try to get it pretty close. So once I've got my beeswax good and smooth, you can see here I take my template, which is a photograph that I've printed on just regular paper in black and white, and this serves as a purpose to keep me from getting the beeswax dirty while I'm working, and it also gives me something to use as reference. So I will cut these individual pieces off. As you can see here, I'm just kind of outlining everything and cutting the shapes of all the tiny areas that I want to replace with magazine paper. And once I get all these cutting in place, sometimes I do this on the whole composition, and sometimes I do a little bit and then go ahead and start cutting my magazine paper. Apparently in this one, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to go ahead and cut all my lines, or at least the majority of them. And then here's where you can see at a regular speed where I take off one piece from that template. You can see the background has the beeswax, and I'm going to take that same shape with the magazine cut, and the color that I want to transfer is face down on the beeswax. And I just repeat this process over and over again until I've replaced the whole template with magazine paper. So as I'm working on it, it starts to look more and more like just a collage. And I'm going to go ahead and we'll speed this process up a little bit. And I'm not going to show me painting this whole panel, but we're going to go through several different areas, different stages of the process, so you can see the progression as I go along. And of course, some of these pieces are really tiny, and then occasionally, like on the areas where there's a lot of sky, for instance, I will cut those pieces a little bit larger. I try to keep the pieces roughly around 1 inch or smaller, but on those outside areas, as you can see, I've done a few in front of me. Those are probably 1.5 inches in random shapes. It depends on what kind of look I'm going for. Sometimes I use curved shapes, and sometimes I use more angular. For compositions like this where it's architecture, I like to use more angular, or squares and triangles, rectangles, things like that, or just random shapes but with straight lines and angles. And I'll continue this process, and we'll come back and see on the next little bit of a video where I've progressed a little bit further. So as things move along, and it depends on the composition too about color. So there are times when I'm really particular about colors I want to use, and I have to keep up with where those colors are going to go, and I want to make sure that I'm putting them in the correct place. Of course, that's where the template really comes in handy, because I can kind of like reference the photo on my computer with this template that I'm working on and choose where my colors need to go. On something like this, I was a little more free. I tried to keep the bridge kind of a rusty look, almost orange, but I got to also play with a lot of random colors in different areas. That's what I like about compositions that have a lot of detail in them. It gives me a chance to play around and add a little more, some interest visually. I can add more textures from the magazines, as in the visual texture. I can add text, things like that. And I always have to keep in mind that those things that are in the magazine are going to be in reverse because I'm doing a transfer off of that page. All right, so just to give you a little insight of the studio time, while I'm cutting paper like this, most of the time I'm just listening to music. There are times when I'm really into the process of choosing colors and I get in the groove. I don't want to be distracted by a podcast or a book. And then there are days that I feel like I've got everything laid out and I need something to kind of help me pass the time. And sometimes it's a book or a podcast that helps me do that. And now you can see we've progressed quite a bit. Most of the panel is full. I like when I get to this point, I start getting a little more free with choosing colors. Maybe put some things in there that are a little out of place so that it adds more interest to the painting. I don't want it to look too much like a photograph, even though I know I'm far from that. But it's fun going through the boxes. You can see here, this is one of them. I've got 8 or 9 of those in my studio at all times. And I try to pull from those instead of going to magazines too often, just because I want to reuse as much as I can. If I'm in a hurry, now I will go to a magazine just because it's a little bit quicker to flip through them and find the colors I need opposed to going through those boxes, which I don't know. I kind of, sometimes it's fun and sometimes it's aggravating. So, and occasionally we got to stop and refill the coffee cup. So I like drinking coffee. You know these videos are in the morning if I got a coffee cup close by. I try to quit that by lunch. And after the panel's covered, I'm taking a wood block here and I'm burnishing that paper into the beeswax. That kind of holds it in place, so when I get to this point where I'm sanding, I can sand the paper and it'll stay in place. It also kind of helps that ink adhere to the beeswax a little bit. So after I sand it, the reason I'm sanding is so I can spray it with water and that will absorb into the paper. It turns it to a pulp, and then I can take my fingers and just basically rub the pulp away from the ink, and the ink is stuck to the beeswax. So when you see one of my paintings, there's no paper on there. It's just, it looks like a collage or a mosaic-like composition, but it's an assemblage of those images and stuff that are pulled from a magazine page. And I think the sanding is probably one of my least favorite parts, especially on compositions like this where there's a lot of tiny, intricate details. The smaller the pieces, the harder the pieces to sand. And I've tried using some different tools to sand with, but nothing really works better than just your bare hands, even though it kind of wears them out. But I've gotten used to it, and some days on something, if it gets this large or larger, sometimes I'll break it up in a couple sessions so I don't get too many blisters. So now we're getting close to completing the sanding, and as you can tell, I like to sand it enough to make it so that there's no gloss on the paper. That way I know that the water will absorb into the paper so I can rub it off. And once that's done, I'll take a wet cloth and wipe away the dust, because it builds up a lot of dust when you sanded the paper. And then I'm going to take a water bottle and just spray enough water on top to where it starts to pool on top of the paper. The thing is, you want the paper to be plenty wet, so when you rub on it, it doesn't have any abrasiveness to it where it would scratch your paper. Scratch the ink. So I wet it really good, and then I'm going to take my hand and just move the paper around. I keep saying paper. I'm going to move the water around on top of the paper so that it gives it a chance to kind of absorb. And after doing this for a long time, I just kind of get a feel for when I know it's right, where I can start putting a little pressure. I just want to make sure that paper has absorbed enough water to where it's not abrasive anymore. And I can put a little pressure on it. Usually it'll start pulping or getting a weird texture to it. That's how I know I can start pushing a little bit down on top of the paper, and it starts releasing from the ink. As you can see here, I do a little test right there in the middle, and if it starts kind of building up under my finger, then I start just putting a little bit more pressure. And I like to work my way around the panel. I don't always do this, but 80% of the time I do a little bit in each area just to make sure that I'm getting to the ink, and then I can get a feel if I need to add more water or not. And typically what I will do is rub off enough of the paper to get to the ink in various spots around the panel, and then I'll come back with the water sprayer and spray more water on top of it just to give it another chance to absorb more. Okay, we're going to zoom through rubbing off more of this paper. Again, I'm working my way around the panel, just making sure I keep that paper wet. And it's funny, there are some times when different magazines will release easier than others, so I try to use certain magazines so I know that consistency. You know, I could easily use 5 or 6 different types of magazines on a composition like this, but I try not to do that because I want, when I'm rubbing off the paper, it to be a consistent feel. Like a Veranda magazine compared to a Cigar Aficionado, for instance. Veranda's a whole lot harder. I have to push a lot harder to get the paper off. Cigar Aficionado is one of the easier ones, and that's what I've used here. For a Whiskey Advocate, it's made the same. And so I use those. See, I'm taking a break here. I'm going to spray some more water on it. I don't want it to get dry because it gets abrasive and it could scratch the ink. So keep it good and wet. I'm just using some tap water and getting a good arm workout. Okay, so we'll speed this up again. Just getting rid of all the paper from the top of the panel. Again, it's important to keep that pulp wet so that it doesn't dry and get where it's abrasive. You don't want to scratch the ink that you just transferred. And I'm going to take, after I've gotten all the pulp off that I can see visually, there's going to be more on there as it dries that the pulp shows up. So I like to take a cotton cloth at least 2 or 3 times. I'll take a really wet cloth, spray the panel again, buff it basically, try to get that residue off, get a different cloth or clean the one I'm using, and just keep going back and forth. And then after it dries and I don't see a lot of white residue, then I know I've gotten enough of the paper pulp off of the panel. Then I'll be ready to seal it or heat it so I can fuse the ink into the beeswax. Because at this point it looks really cool, but the ink is just kind of sitting on top. It's probably fine, it would never go anywhere, but I like to go ahead and fuse it just to make sure it's set in there well. It's a delicate medium anyhow, so I want to give it every chance to survive as I can. So here I'm going to get the heat gun and just I work my way around the panel with the heat gun and just kind of keep an eye on it. I don't want to get it too hot, but I want to make sure that that ink is kind of set into the beeswax. You see, I keep it moving around, and the funny thing is I'm usually looking at it kind of at an angle or with a light so I can see the reflection of when the wax gets warm, it gets shiny. And if I get it too hot, the ink that's sitting on top of the wax will actually move around. So I try to get it to the point where it's almost going to move, but it doesn't. And one thing I notice is the darker the color, the thicker the ink is. So if I'm in an area where it's, say, a black, for instance, or a really dark brown, as I hit it with the heat gun, it takes a little longer to heat it up compared to where there's a whiter or yellow or something of lighter color. Those heat up really fast. So like the center of this bridge, for instance, you can tell it's darker, it's in the shadows. It takes a little longer with the heat. One thing I do notice is that those thicker areas also, they kind of crinkle on top of the beeswax, so it looks flat if you don't fuse it. And then as I fuse it, that ink kind of crinkles or almost bubbles. It looks different after I've fused it. And it kind of adds a little something interesting to the painting. It's not real noticeable unless you're standing up real close to it. That's another reason why I put a sealer on at the end, is to kind of even out the surface. Even from the same magazines, inks will transfer. Some will be more glossy than others. Some are pretty matte as far as the finish looks. And so I always like to go in with a varnish, a gloss varnish, semi-gloss, and put on top of it, and it evens all that out as much as it can. You can still tell at an angle when you look at one of my paintings, some pieces do have a different look to them than others. Again, it's kind of a cool part of the process that makes the painting more interesting. And again, this is another part of the process that takes a little while to do, but it's well worth doing. As you can see, I'm always taking photos and videos of my process and just about every painting I do. Not all of them, but a large percentage of them. I just don't have time to edit the videos like this. So we'll probably get some more of these out. All right, after I've fused the panel, I do typically wait. I didn't show it on the video, but I take a pause and let the panel kind of cool down a little bit. I don't like it to be too soft when I'm carving. I actually prefer it to be almost completely cool, but a little bit of warm to it's okay, because it makes the tool go through the beeswax a little easier. If it's too soft, it's too easy to screw up, and plus, as you can see, I usually sit my arm or hands on top of the panel while I'm working. I don't want it to be warm enough to where it's mushy and I'm interfering with the ink on top of the beeswax. And I'm just taking, I usually start out with just a sharp instrument. This is a book art tool. It's just a pointy object, like an ice pick. And I usually go through the composition and do the outlines of things and look at where I want to have highlights. And if it's an area that I want to bring more highlights to, then I may change my tools. You can see sitting there, I've got a wire loop tool. So that will take away a little bit more of the ink off. And what that's doing is removing the ink and revealing the beeswax and the plywood in the background, which is a lighter color than the ink itself. And occasionally I will use a straight edge, as you can see here. Make sure I get some good straight lines, and sometimes I don't care and I just freehand it. The problem with freehanding is it's easy to slip. Again, that's where I want to make sure the wax is a little bit soft so I don't have to force it. And it's crazy the difference in my paintings after I've done the carving. And we're going to go ahead and split this up, work this video so that it speeds up and we don't have to sit here and go through 20 minutes of me carving. So this is another part of my process that's very time consuming. It's not days time consuming, but it takes several hours. And I'm just going through and I'm referencing a photo on my computer screen and just looking for areas that I feel need some definition, some highlights, and just taking my tools and trying to work those in to add a little more depth to the painting. Sometimes I can do more than on some than others. I really like something like this that's got a lot of depth to it on its own. The foreground of the train, and it goes back into perspective, you know, to the background. So we're cutting out a lot of the detail cutting here, so you don't have to sit through it. But as you can see, I'm getting towards the end now. You can already see a big difference of how the composition looks. And then, of course, the colors will be more vibrant once I put the sealer on it. At this point, it's gotten dry, so it's started retaining some of that flatness to it. And the sealer will bring back that wet look where the colors are more vibrant and the composition looks a little more three-dimensional. I wanted to talk real quickly about how I can use a tool. I'm getting ready to do that on this piece of metal there in the center, where I want to make something lighter, but I don't want to carve off too much. I basically do a reverse crosshatch. So you can see I'm scraping away a little bit of the ink that's transferred on top of the beeswax, just to give it a kind of a rustic look. So that's always cool to play with, things like that. And if an area is too dark, I can use that technique to lighten it up without removing a huge chunk of color. And I take all these, as I'm scraping that color away, I'm getting these little balls of ink and beeswax, and I just put them in a container. They usually go in the trash, or sometimes I can recycle and let that ink settle to the bottom of the container. The beeswax will stay on top. And as you can see, I'm carving my initials in, and that's when I feel like I'm done with it. So I'll take the heat gun and kind of fuse everything together again. Just make sure all that is set in place, and then it's ready to put a sealer on it. Thanks for watching. Here you're getting ready to see the finished piece. It's called Converge. It's one of my favorite paintings. I like architectural pieces like this. So we'll see you next time.